draw the link between the culture of workplace bullying, psychological injury, and the constant churn, the endless restructuring of the workplace, the downsizing, the casualisation, the precariousness of work. How is it possible to address this culture, the growing culture of bullying, unless we address the pernicious ideology of economic rationalism, neoliberalism, which is happening both on the federally and in the state? What can we do to effect real change?
Well, I think that's the real political challenge. I mean, when you see this rise in bullying, you see it paralleled with this extraordinary rise in casualisation and temporary employment. You know, Australia has one of the highest rates of casual employment in the developed world. Steve Turner earlier gave some evidence, and I don't know if you quite followed what Steve was putting forward about temporary employees in the public sector. And something like 20% of employees in the public sector are temporary employees, meaning they haven't got any guaranteed job security. And if you're a temporary employee and you go to get a mortgage, you often get told, well, I'm sorry, there's no guarantee you'll be here in 2 years' time, so we're not willing to extend your credit. And remarkably, something like 12 or 13,000, maybe a few more, employees in the New South Wales public sector have been temporary employees for 5 years or more. How on earth we get to a point where they're temporary for 5 years or more is just extraordinary. There's meant to be a policy in place that they get reviewed after 12 months and efforts are made to give people permanent employment. The government's genius response to that in some public government employment rules that they came up with was to say, well, it's bad that people are in temporary positions for 5 years or more. And they're right. So they said, as of 25 February, it is impermissible for anybody to be a temporary employee for 5 years or more. And anyone who's a temporary employee for 5 years or more is terminated. Now, of course, that fixes your problem with all these people as temporary employees in one fell swoop by utterly victimising them and terminating them in one go. And so when we were talking about in that inquiry, you know, how's it going with the temporary employment and like, he said, well, here's a significant problem, not just in WorkCover, but across the workforce in New South Wales. And we ran a little campaign and actually shamed the government into changing its policy. And they've now got a 2-year extension, an actual pathway is being negotiated into permanent employment. But unless we fix the casualisation of the workplace, unless we fix job security, and I think the lady who was talking earlier about her teaching position, I think you're on probationary employment as well. Yeah, and that's when it starts. And you get an extension of probation employment, you get insecure position, you know your job is at the whim of your manager, and you're unwilling to raise issues. And the manager feels empowered in how they can bully you because the power relationship is so in their favour. And in WorkCover, that decade of constant churn meant that nobody felt secure in their position. And when they're not feeling secure in their position, first of all, they're not willing to back up a co-worker when they see a co-worker being bullied, because if you stick your head up, you get it kicked. And they're not willing to challenge management, because if you challenge management, well, the next time you go for your job, you suddenly find you're an unfavoured candidate.
Or join a union.
Yeah, or join a union. So there are a number of different ways of approaching that. I think we need to do everything we can to improve the status of casual work and temporary work so that we give far greater protection to people in casual and temporary work to make it a less attractive alternative for employers, and also to greatly promote and enhance their security of employment. There are a number of strategies to do that. Probably tonight's not the one to take us through those strategies, but transition to permanency, guaranteed hours, rights of unfair dismissal, those are some pretty basic starting points that we need to roll out to casual and temporary employees in order to level the playing field.
Tonight we've been mainly dealing with people working for the public service. What's the situation in the private sector? Do we know anything about what's the incidence? What's the nature of the bullying? What channels do people in the private sector, which after all employs the majority of people? Okay, that's my first question. My second question is that when in your presentation you mentioned that the most bullied group are women over 40, I thought, my God, I mean, that really is misogyny. That really is. I mean, given the natural respect people have for older people, we hope. What's your thinking of why women over 40 are the most targeted group?
As you know, women tend to be disadvantaged at all stages in their career, and women in their 40s, a good number of them are coming back in and trying to recover from the 7 lost years of their career when they were out of the workplace raising children, and can be enormously challenging for them. I think those structures are definitely in place and prejudice women in the workplace, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector. But I mean, the coincidence between bullying at that age and the fact that you would be expecting women to be coming to seek to re-establish their careers at that stage, I think it'd be foolish to suggest there's no connection between them. The figures that I've seen on bullying don't suggest that bullying is more or less endemic in the public or the private sector. From the materials that I recall seeing, it's about the same across public and private. There are remarkably slightly better formal structures within the public sector to deal with bullying, but the experience in WorkCover was that those formal structures sometimes themselves became instruments of bullying in the public sector, rather bizarrely. And in fact, not bullying someone through process is often something that organisations in the public sector need to strive for, and there was a lot of bullying through process in WorkCover. Private employers, people in the private sector have the same right to approach WorkCover if they've got a complaint about bullying. They have the same work health safety rights, they have the same workers' comp rights as people in the public sector. But I don't think that there's any great statistical difference between the prevalence of bullying in the two sectors.
We'll have some questions now. As Steve Turner said prior to his departure, if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask Steve, obviously he's not here to physically answer them, but if you text them or email them to me, I'll give you my email address, I can pass them on to Steve, and he's a wonderful answerer of questions, a champion answerer of questions. The only greater champion of question answerers is David Shoebridge.
I'm better at asking.
Thanks, David. That was a terrific presentation. I'm really grateful that you could be here tonight. I'm just wondering if you can, if you have any idea of the incidence of any suicides related to workplace bullying in either New South Wales or nationally.
Well, I don't have any figures in my mind, but I think there's no doubt that the real impact of workplace bullying is psychological injury and ongoing, quite severe psychological injury in the worst cases of workplace bullying. I think you'd be foolish to think that never ends up at the most extreme outcome. I think undoubtedly it would. Which is why I find it very frustrating. It's not just in this WorkCover bullying inquiry, but I've done other work in the Parliament looking at workplace injuries, and it's not just in WorkCover, but it's in workplaces across the state. We find that psychological injuries are always treated as second-rate, not really serious, proper injuries. In fact, I've got a forum on the 2nd of December dealing with psychologically injured police and the failure of the New South Wales Police Force to deal with, in any humane or decent way, the many police who suffer post-traumatic stress disorder from the extraordinary trauma that they face in their job as police. You know, we pay police to run to danger, and you would think that therefore, when they get injured or they have quite significant psychological trauma from their work, you think that we would actually have a system in place where we stand by them, but instead, when they report with psychological injuries, there's often little, if any, counselling support. They get excluded from the force. They're basically treated like they've got a contagious disease, in large part, injured police. And when they get boarded out of the police force, hurt on duty, they then get excluded really from the culture of the New South Wales Police Force, treated really like they've got a contagion. They lose their social structure, their identity of being a police officer, and they're dealing with the psychological trauma. And to add to that, many of them fight for years, literally years, with a particularly rapacious insurer called MetLife to try and get some decent compensation. This is not just work cover, it's workplaces across the spectrum treat psychological injuries as second class, as second rate, not real injuries. And I think we need to address that and overcome that because it aggravates the trauma.
Thank you. Next question, Bruce.
My name is Bruce Toms. I'm in the Progressive Labor Party, which is independent of the ALP. The question is related to your statement of the need for an independent authority to appeal to. Now, what's the position of the Ombudsman? Would that become the independent authority?
Well, I think when you're talking about work health safety matters, you're best off trying to find somebody with work health safety expertise, and that's not the Ombudsman's main domain. So what the committee proposed and what the government has now implemented is that the Safety Inspectorate of the Department of Trade, and that's a safety inspectorate that is focused on mining-related injuries and mining-related safety, and they independently regulate what goes on at mining sites, separate to work cover, who do every other site in the state. We determined that those safety inspectorates, that safety inspectorate would be the most suitable independent body to deal with OHS complaints or work health safety complaints out of work cover. The ink is really just dry on the agreement between the two organisations and the referral agreement between the two organisations. I think it's fair to say that it's unclear at the moment how that will work. I think that the process and the structure that's in place for injured workers to complain to Department of Trade is unclear, as I understand it, even to many people in work cover at the moment. So we need to keep a watching brief on that. But I think for those reasons, I think that's a better first option than the Ombudsman. But if it doesn't work, well then I think potentially the Ombudsman is something we can look at later. I'll just say one of the other options we considered was to refer complaints from Work Cover New South Wales to an interstate regulator like WorkSafe Victoria or the like, which was kind of attractive on one level. But we determined that probably wouldn't be practical. You'd much better off having someone who can actually come and visit the workplace without any great barriers, rather than have something in another state. But that's another option that we could potentially look at.
I'm in the education department, and I think I fit into the category of being over 40 and female, and I started the job at a later age, so I think there's been a difficulty with peers accepting that someone can move from another career, having all the qualifications. So I've been in a situation where I've been bullied by an assistant principal for the last year, so I've actually passed it on to an acting assistant principal, I should say. Passed it on to the assistant principal, my immediate boss, who has now joined in the bullying to protect the acting assistant principal. So now we have a new principal at the school who seems to be trying to take my information impartially and deal with it. But as nothing's happened since last November, I went to the Director of Education of the region that I work in, had a private meeting with him during the holidays, which went for 3 hours, took a support person, and he seemed to be taking down my concerns, but I haven't heard back from him. That was in September. And I've now concluded there's a total inability within the school system for any principal, any executive staff to take action against other executive staff. They simply will not take action. They will go back to the executive staff again and again to check the validity of everything I say, never getting back to me to face the complaint. So I've been waiting a year, since September, with a personal meeting with the director. He has emailed me to say he's looking into it, but I'm wondering what would be the next step. What would you suggest? I am thinking down the track, if they try to take my job away, I will probably need to go to lawyers, but what would you think would be the next step?
Well, one of the first steps I think workers need to take is contact their union. And I had a chat with you earlier and you said you'd contacted your union, they might have done some initial help, but I mean, I'm a paid up member of the PSA. I wonder how, when I get bullied on a daily basis down in my workplace, down on the floor of the New South Wales Parliament, and I'd love to call the union in. But I think, in fact, my workplace is kind of endemic with bullying. If you ever have the misfortune of going and watching any parliament, you'll often see, you know, writ large, a bullying culture. If you've exhausted the avenues with your union, you're meant to be able, once you make a complaint, or you put in, if you've suffered an injury and a psychological injury as a result of the bullying, you're meant to be able to put in a complaint to WorkCover. And if you want to know exactly why it was so important that we had the inquiry to try and fix bullying in WorkCover, it's because they need to be a resource that injured workers or bullied workers can go to in other workplaces to come in and do a genuine review. But I've got to say that hasn't been working particularly well to date in New South Wales. And I might just quickly read you the first 3 paragraphs of another case study about a woman called Casey, who came and gave evidence to the committee. I'll just read it. Casey was bullied in her local government workplace and lodged a complaint with WorkCover online. She did not feel comfortable including all her documentation, so she requested that the inspector allocated to her case contact her before visiting her workplace. Despite this request, nobody contacted Casey, and her complaint was initially assessed as not having provided sufficient information. The complaint was allocated to an inspector who'd been working with her employer on a work health and safety liaison project. Rather than speaking with Casey in the first instance, the inspector spoke directly with her workplace management team, including the manager and human resources officer, who were the subject of the allegations. He disclosed Casey's identity, collected adverse information about her, and subsequently closed the investigation without advising her. It goes on, a number of weeks passed, she made a public interest complaint, and then it concludes in this way. According to Casey, in handling her complaint, WorkCover did not follow its own investigation protocols, nor did it practice procedural fairness. Procedures for confidentiality were not followed. Casey was not contacted by the investigator to find out details of her complaint. She wasn't given an opportunity to respond to information provided by others. She was not consulted on the findings. Casey believes that as a result of her complaint to WorkCover, she was further victimised by her manager and human resource officer, who went on to conduct vexatious disciplinary proceedings against her. She was ostracised by her colleagues, lost her professional reputation, and ultimately her career. Now, I hate to tell you, that's the organisation that you need to make a complaint to.
But she says exactly what's being...
Well, and I can only hope that WorkCover has taken on board our critique. And I think, as I said, there's some hope that the culture has improved and the management have a different culture. And will, if you make a complaint, treat you in confidence, give you procedural fairness, and seek to actually go in and fix what's happening in your workplace. That's why we did this report.
Has there been any attempt to bring about some facilitated conversations between yourself and the person who's bullying you?
I've requested a mediation. I requested that of my boss back in about April this year, and she has kept, she just keeps fobbing it off. So then I went to the principal above her head, and the principal has been trying to organise a mediation.
Yes.
Principal's been trying to organise a mediation at my request since August, and now she informed me this week in an email that my boss has declined to attend the mediation. And the other person who's doing the bullying, the assistant acting principal, is still willing to attend a mediation, but we haven't been able to find a mediator. This is in the education department, we can't find a mediator, but they think they might have found someone now. And as there's only 4 weeks to go till the end of the year, I hope she's very willing and ready to come along, because otherwise this won't happen this year.
Sometimes in situations like that, you can almost self-mediate. You don't need a person with buckets of mediation qualifications. Sometimes, and this is not to underplay the awfulness of what you're going through, but in many situations, particularly where you've got people who should have insight into the problem, sometimes it's simply a matter of sitting down with a very simple 4-point agenda. The first agenda item is acknowledging past harm, acknowledging and hopefully even apologising, and getting a sense of ownership on the part of the people who are bullying you. The second thing on the second item on the agenda should be finding common ground, because sometimes the only common ground is that both the person who's being bullied and the bully wake up in the morning and they go to the workplace because they want to do their work and do it well to the best of their ability. Sometimes that's the only common ground, but even just acknowledging that is sufficient. The next thing is to identify how you're going to move forward, so the way forward. And then the final item is acknowledging and taking ownership of what that future working relationship between you might look like. I know that sounds really simple, and I don't make it with those comments to try and minimise.
Thank you. It's good to have some basic information like that.
But sometimes, and not always, but sometimes even the most terrifying experiences of workplace bullying can be resolved just by that simple
That's very
chatter.
helpful.
What I was going to share with you is the 13 psychosocial risk factors that I mentioned at the beginning, and it's dealt with in that Guarding Minds at Work website that I referred to. So some of them are very obvious and some of them aren't. Psychological support, organisational culture, which includes local work group and workplace culture, clear leadership and expectations, so unequivocal direction from managers, civility and respect at all levels of the organisation, so that you're able to build trust between managers and workers. It has to be a two-way flowing phenomenon. Good psychological job fit. Sometimes you have people in managerial roles in private and public sector organisations for which they're simply not equipped. They don't have the soft skills. What I mean by soft skills is the capacity to bring out the best in people. And using your education department example of the two people who are bullying yourself, in some cases they are unlikely, and I don't know whether this is the case with these two, but this is why I suggested that 4-point agenda. If you can just get them round, it doesn't have to be a structured thing with a mediator. Sometimes you can do it over a coffee. Or maybe that's part of the culture that has to change, is have coffee chats. And being able to then identify those blind spots that those two bullies have. It may be that they don't understand the unintended consequences of their behaviour, because in many cases, even though the victim of bullying may be convinced that his or her boss is a complete psychopath and gets up in the morning, the first thing they think about before they even get out of bed is, what can I do when I get to work and monster this person? How can I monster this person more today than I did yesterday? Well, so this. Now, when you ask that psychopath, is that the first thing they think about in the morning? And if they're answering honestly, chances are it's not the first thing they think about. Because often the phenomenon of bullying is unintended consequences of somebody's behaviour. Not always, but in some cases. And that's why mediation of that very informal structure that I'm suggesting in this particular instance might be worthwhile. It opens up people's awareness about how they come across. I'll just finish the dot points and I'll hand back to David. Growth and development, so commitment to bringing out those soft skills, recognition and reward, involvement and influence, workload management, engagement, balance, including work-life balance, psychological protection and protection of physical safety. So those 13 factors have been identified through that Canadian research as the 13 critical psychosocial risk factors. And what do you notice about them all, with the possible exception of the last one? They're all invisible. You can't see any of them. And that's why when you're doing a workplace inspection or a safety walk or an assessment of the hazards and risks in any particular workplace, private or public sector, or even the non-government organisations, the NGOs, the last thing people tend to pick up on is psychosocial hazards, simply because, unlike trip hazards that we were worrying about with this microphone cord earlier, and electrical hazards, you can't see them, they're invisible.
There's one other important distinction between the private and the public sector, particularly in New South Wales, is that in the private sector, employees now have a right to go to the federal Fair Work Commission on a bullying complaint, and there's actually a remedy in place for private sector employees in New South Wales. It's a somewhat imperfect, relatively untested remedy, but the remedy is now there to address bullying for private sector employees. But public sector employees in New South Wales don't have a bullying remedy. And one of the other recommendations we made as a committee was that there be a parallel remedy in the Industrial Relations Commission in New South Wales for public sector workers that mirrors the remedy that's available there for private sector workers and Commonwealth employees with Fair Work Australia. And it's an obvious hole in workplace regulation.
Could I just invite you to join me in thanking David Shoebridge. The work that you do, David, I think, and as I said before during the introduction, when you spoke for 5 hours and 58 minutes in relation to protecting workers' rights, congratulations on that record. As I said, I've read the Hansard transcript of that speech. It's a wonderful speech, and every single word of it, without any exception, made the world a better place. So congratulations, more power to you, and thank you so much for the wonderful work that you've done right across your portfolio, and we wish you well in your ongoing endeavours across that very broad spectrum of wonderful work. So please join me in thanking David Shoebridge.